Thomas Henderson had always believed that life moved in straight lines. Wake up at 6:30, shower, dress in his worn but clean maintenance uniform, grab a cup of instant coffee, and catch the early bus to Kensington Palace. For 12 years, he had followed this routine without deviation, moving through the grand corridors and manicured gardens like a ghost among royalty. At 54, Thomas carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find purpose in invisible work. His calloused hands bore testament to decades of fixing what others broke, cleaning what others soiled, and maintaining the pristine facade that the public expected from royal residences. He took pride in his work, even if no one ever noticed the freshly polished door handles or the perfectly aligned picture frames that marked his passage through the palace. The other staff members knew Thomas as a reliable, if somewhat solitary figure. He arrived early, left late, and rarely participated in the casual conversations that filled the staff quarters during breaks. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, exactly. He simply seemed to exist in his own quiet world, speaking only when necessary and always with a gentle courtesy that made others feel comfortable in his presence. What his colleagues didn't know was that Thomas had not always been this way. Before the palace, before the uniform, before the careful routine that now defined his days, he had been a different man entirely. He had been a father. The memory of his daughter Emma lived in a carefully guarded corner of his heart, protected by layers of routine and purpose that he had built around himself like armor. Emma would have been 28 now, with her mother's bright eyes and her father's stubborn determination. She would have been planning her wedding to that nice young teacher she had been dating, the one who made her laugh until she snorted with joy. But Emma existed now only in photographs that Thomas kept in his small flat, in the birthday cards he still bought but never sent, and in the terrible, persistent ache that 12 years of steady work had never quite managed to heal. The cancer had taken her when she was 16, stealing not just her future but seemingly all the color from Thomas's world. After Emma's death, Thomas had found himself unable to return to his old life as a carpenter. The houses he had once built with such care now seemed like monuments to impermanence. Instead, he had sought work at the palace, drawn perhaps by the illusion of stability, the sense that some things endured beyond individual tragedy. On this particular Tuesday morning in late autumn, Thomas was assigned to the palace gardens, preparing for a small charity event that Princess Charlotte would be attending. The 7-year-old princess was known among the staff for her bright curiosity and genuine warmth, qualities that both charmed and slightly intimidated the workers who encountered her during official functions. Thomas worked methodically, checking that each garden light was functioning properly, clearing fallen leaves from the pathways, and ensuring that the outdoor seating areas were spotless. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and he found himself moving more quickly than usual to stay warm. As he worked near the rose garden, adjusting a loose stone in the pathway, Thomas became aware of voices approaching. He recognized the measured tones of Mrs. Pemberton, the senior household staff member who often accompanied the royal children during their outdoor activities. With her was a lighter voice, animated and curious, asking questions about the different types of roses that still bloomed despite the advancing season. Thomas straightened, intending to move discreetly to another area until the group had passed. It was standard protocol to give the royal family space during their private moments, and he had long since perfected the art of becoming invisible when necessary. But, as he gathered his tools, something caught his attention. Mrs. Pemberton was explaining to Princess Charlotte about the garden's history, how it had been redesigned after the war to include varieties that bloomed throughout the year, providing color even during the darkest months. Even in winter, Your Highness, Mrs. Pemberton was saying, these particular roses continue to bloom. They're quite resilient, much like people, I suppose. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most challenging circumstances. Thomas found himself pausing, struck by the unexpected poetry in the woman's practical explanation. He had tended these gardens for years but had never thought of them in quite that way. To him, they had simply been another responsibility, another task to complete with quiet efficiency. "They're beautiful," came Princess Charlotte's voice, closer now. "May I pick one for my grandmother? She loves roses, and I think she might be feeling sad today." There was something in the child's voice, a gentle concern that seemed remarkably mature for her age, that made Thomas look up despite himself. Princess Charlotte stood near the rose bushes, her school uniform neat beneath a navy coat, her hair catching the pale morning sunlight. She was studying the flowers with the serious concentration of someone much older, clearly trying to select the perfect bloom. Mrs. Pemberton was explaining the proper way to cut a rose stem when Princess Charlotte's attention was suddenly captured by something else entirely. She had noticed Thomas, partially hidden behind a large gardening cart, watching their interaction with an expression of unexpected tenderness. For a moment, their eyes met across the small distance of the garden path. Thomas saw recognition in the child's face, not of him specifically, but of something deeper. Perhaps it was the way he was looking at her, with a mixture of protective fondness and distant sadness that reminded her of how her grandfather sometimes watched her and her brothers when he thought no one was looking. Thomas immediately looked away, embarrassed to have been caught staring. He began to move toward a different section of the garden, but Princess Charlotte's voice stopped him. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being heard, tempered by genuine politeness. "Are you the one who takes care of these roses?" Thomas turned slowly, uncertain of the proper protocol for this situation. He was not supposed to engage directly with members of the royal family unless specifically addressed about work matters, and, even then, interactions were meant to be brief and formal. "Yes, Your Highness," he replied quietly, removing his wool cap in a gesture of respect that felt natural rather than rehearsed. "I maintain the gardens." Princess Charlotte smiled, a bright expression that transformed her serious face into something genuinely joyful. "They're absolutely lovely. My grandmother would adore them. Do you have a favorite?" The question caught Thomas off guard. In 12 years of palace work, no member of the royal family had ever asked him about his preferences, his thoughts, or anything beyond the immediate requirements of his duties. He found himself genuinely considering her question. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I'm particularly fond of the white ones near the chapel. They bloom late into November, long after the others have finished. There's something hopeful about that." As soon as the words left his mouth, Thomas worried that he had said too much, revealed too much of himself in his answer. But Princess Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, as if his response made perfect sense. "Hopeful," she repeated. "Yes, I can see that. Things that keep going when everything else has stopped must be very brave." The simple profundity of her observation struck Thomas like a physical blow. Here was a child, barely 7 years old, articulating something he had been struggling to understand for more than a decade. The roses that bloomed beyond their season, the people who continued to function after loss, the daily choice to keep going when everything else seemed to have stopped. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been allowing the conversation to continue while keeping a watchful eye on propriety, gently reminded Princess Charlotte that they needed to return for her afternoon lessons. The child nodded obediently but seemed reluctant to leave the conversation unfinished. "Thank you for taking such good care of the garden," she said to Thomas with formal politeness. Then, with the impulsiveness of childhood, she added, "I hope you'll continue to watch over the brave roses." As the group moved away toward the palace, Thomas stood alone among the flower beds, his tools forgotten in his hands. The brief encounter had lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but it had somehow shifted something fundamental in how he saw himself and his work. For 12 years, he had thought of himself as simply maintaining the gardens, keeping up appearances, fulfilling the basic requirements of his position. But Princess Charlotte's words had reframed his daily labor as something more significant. He was watching over things that chose to bloom despite difficult circumstances. He was tending hope itself. That evening, as Thomas made his way home on the late bus, he found himself thinking about Emma in a different way than usual. Instead of focusing on what had been lost, he began to remember what had endured. Emma's laugh lived on in his memory. Her kindness had shaped how he treated others. Her courage during those final months had taught him something about the possibility of grace under impossible circumstances. Perhaps, he thought as London's lights blurred past the bus window, he had been one of those late-blooming roses all along, continuing to function and care and contribute long after it seemed like his season for flourishing had ended. Princess Charlotte had seen something in him that he had not been able to see in himself, the quiet bravery of persistence, the hope inherent in simply continuing to show up. The next morning, Thomas's routine remained the same in its external details, but something internal had shifted. As he tended the gardens, he found himself really looking at the plants under his care, noticing not just what needed to be fixed or cleaned, but what was thriving, what was struggling, what needed a little extra attention to reach its potential. And, when he came to the white roses near the chapel, the ones he had mentioned to Princess Charlotte, he spent a few extra moments ensuring they had everything they needed to continue their brave blooming into the darker months ahead. They were, after all, in his care. They were depending on him to help them fulfill their hopeful purpose. For the first time in 12 years, Thomas felt like he was doing more than just maintaining the palace grounds. He was participating in something larger, something that connected the careful tending of gardens to the careful tending of hope itself. A 7-year-old princess had seen this truth clearly, and, in seeing it, had helped him begin to see it too. As he worked, Thomas found himself wondering what other insights the royal children might carry, what other truths they might see with the clarity that sometimes comes from looking at the world with fresh eyes. He had always assumed that his role was simply to serve, to remain invisible while others lived their important lives. But, perhaps there was more to it than that. Perhaps even the most seemingly insignificant interactions could plant seeds of understanding that would bloom in unexpected ways. Perhaps the gentle touch of recognition, the simple acknowledgement of another person's care and effort, could be transformative for both the giver and the receiver. Thomas didn't know that this brief encounter in the rose garden would prove to be the beginning of something much larger. He couldn't have predicted how Princess Charlotte's natural compassion and curiosity would continue to intersect with his quiet life in ways that would challenge and change them both. What he did know, as he finished his work that Tuesday morning, was that he felt more present in his own life than he had in years. The garden seemed more vivid, his purpose more clear, and the possibility of connection more real than it had been since Emma's death had convinced him that meaningful relationships were too dangerous to risk. The princess had seen him, really seen him, not as just another piece of the palace machinery but as a person whose work and care mattered. That recognition, offered with such natural grace, had awakened something in Thomas that he had thought was permanently dormant. As he walked back toward the palace for his afternoon assignments, Thomas caught sight of a late-blooming rose that had somehow escaped his morning attention. Its petals were thick and waxy, built to withstand the coming cold, and it seemed to glow with its own inner light against the fading autumn landscape. He made a mental note to check on it tomorrow, to ensure it had everything it needed for its brave and hopeful blooming. It was, after all, one of the things in his care. And, caring, he was beginning to remember, was perhaps the most important work anyone could do. 3 weeks had passed since the encounter in the rose garden, and Thomas found that his perspective on the palace grounds had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. Where once he had seen only tasks to be completed, he now noticed the intricate web of life that flourished under his care. The gardens had become less like a responsibility and more like a living testament to resilience and hope. During those weeks, Thomas had caught glimpses of Princess Charlotte during her outdoor activities, but they had not spoken again. He had returned to his practiced invisibility, moving through his duties with quiet efficiency while carrying the memory of their conversation like a small flame in his chest. The roses she had admired continued to bloom, defying the increasingly cold October weather, and Thomas found himself checking on them each morning with particular attention. On this Thursday afternoon, Thomas was working in the less formal section of the gardens, near the area where the royal children sometimes played during their break times. He was replacing several boards in a wooden bench that had begun to show signs of weather damage, his hands moving with the practiced skill of someone who had spent a lifetime working with tools. The work required concentration, but not so much that he couldn't hear the approaching voices of children at play. Prince George and Prince Louis were engaged in an elaborate game that seemed to involve both pirates and space exploration, their imagination transforming the garden pathways into exotic alien worlds. Princess Charlotte followed behind them, not quite participating in their adventure but watching with the amused tolerance of an older sister who found her brother's games entertaining if somewhat juvenile. Thomas continued his work, expecting the children to pass by without noticing him. But, as he fitted a new board into place, he became aware that the chatter had stopped. When he looked up, he found Prince Louis standing very close to the bench, studying Thomas's tools with the intense curiosity of a 5-year-old. "What are you making?" Louis asked with the directness that only young children possessed. His uniform was slightly disheveled from play, and there was a smudge of dirt on his cheek that suggested he had been exploring areas not typically approved for royal recreation. Thomas glanced toward Mrs. Pemberton, who was supervising from a discreet distance, and received an encouraging nod. "I'm repairing the bench, Your Highness," he explained gently. The wood had become damaged by the weather, so I'm replacing the broken pieces with new ones. Why don't you just get a new bench? Prince George asked, approaching with the logical mindset of a 9-year-old who assumed all problems had simple solutions. Thomas considered the question carefully. It was the kind of inquiry that deserved a thoughtful response, not just because it came from a prince, but because it touched on something he had been thinking about quite a lot lately. Well, Thomas said, setting down his hammer and giving the boys his full attention, this bench has been here for many years. People have sat on it to rest, to think, to watch the gardens change with the seasons. It has stories and memories built into it. When we repair something instead of replacing it, we honor those stories while making it strong enough for new memories to be made. Princess Charlotte had drifted closer during this explanation, her expression thoughtful. Like when Mummy has her favorite dress mended instead of buying a new one, she offered. She says some things become more precious when they've been carefully fixed. Exactly like that, Your Highness, Thomas replied, struck once again by the child's ability to grasp complex concepts and express them with startling clarity. Prince Louis was now examining the tools laid out on Thomas's workbench with the systematic thoroughness of a young scientist. What's this one for? He asked, pointing to a hand plane. Thomas picked up the tool, his weathered hands cradling it with obvious familiarity and respect. This is used to smooth wood, to take away the rough edges and make surfaces even. It's one of my oldest tools. My father taught me to use it when I was not much older than you. Your father was a carpenter too? Princess Charlotte asked, settling onto the grass near the bench with the unconscious grace of childhood. He was, Thomas replied, surprised by how naturally the conversation was flowing. He taught me that working with wood was like having a conversation. You have to listen to what the wood wants to become, respect its nature, and help it fulfill its potential. Prince George sat down beside his sister, apparently finding this discussion more interesting than their previous game. What did he make? Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the bittersweet ache that always accompanied memories of his father and the trade they had shared. But there was something about the children's genuine interest that made it easier to speak about the past. He built houses, Thomas said quietly. He used to say that every nail he drove, every beam he placed, was helping to create a place where families could grow and thrive. He was very proud of that work. Do you build houses too? Prince Louis asked, still investigating the tools with careful hands. I used to, Thomas admitted. Before I came to work here, I built houses with my father, and then, on my own for many years. But sometimes life changes in ways we don't expect, and we find ourselves called to different kinds of work. Princess Charlotte studied Thomas's face with the perceptive gaze that he was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her personality. What made you change? She asked gently. The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct and impossible to answer without revealing more of himself than Thomas had shared with anyone in over a decade. He could feel Mrs. Pemberton's attention from across the garden, could sense her slight tension as she monitored a conversation that was venturing into unexpectedly personal territory. But there was something about Princess Charlotte's expression, open and compassionate and entirely without judgment, that made Thomas want to offer her honesty rather than deflection. These children had shared their curiosity and natural warmth with him. Perhaps he owed them something more substantial than polite evasion. I lost someone very important to me, Thomas said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying his words. My daughter. After that, building houses felt different. I needed to find a different way to take care of things. The three children absorbed this information with the remarkable adaptability of young minds. They didn't offer awkward condolences or ask intrusive questions about details. Instead, they seemed to understand intuitively that Thomas had shared something precious and painful, and they received it with the gravity it deserved. I'm sorry about your daughter, Princess Charlotte said simply. It must be very hard to miss someone you love so much. It is, Thomas agreed. But working here, taking care of the gardens and helping maintain this beautiful place, has helped me find a way to honor her memory. She loved beautiful things, loved watching things grow and flourish. Prince Louis had abandoned his exploration of the tools and was now sitting cross-legged in the grass, his attention fully focused on Thomas. What was her name? he asked with the matter-of-fact directness that made children such honest companions. Emma, Thomas replied, and saying her name aloud to these children felt different from the careful way he usually held it in his thoughts. It felt lighter somehow, less like a secret burden and more like a gift he was sharing. Emma, Princess Charlotte repeated softly, as if testing the sound of it. That's a beautiful name. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. Thomas returned to his work on the bench, but the children remained nearby, seemingly content to watch him sand and fit the wood pieces together. There was something peaceful about their presence, something that reminded Thomas of afternoons spent working alongside Emma when she was young, teaching her to use simple tools and explaining how different types of wood responded to careful handling. Mr. Thomas, Prince George said eventually, using a formal address that nonetheless felt warm and friendly. Would you teach us how to use the plane? The request caught Thomas off guard. Royal children were typically kept at a careful distance from anything that might be considered remotely dangerous, and woodworking tools certainly fell into that category. He glanced toward Mrs. Pemberton, expecting to see alarm or disapproval. Instead, he found her walking closer, her expression thoughtful rather than concerned. The children have been asking about learning practical skills, she said. Their parents believe it's important for them to understand how things work, how things are made and maintained. Thomas looked down at the plane in his hands, then at the three eager faces watching him. Teaching children to work with tools had always been one of his greatest joys, first with Emma and, then, occasionally with the children of clients who had shown interest in his craftsmanship. Well, he said slowly, I suppose we could start with something very simple. But, you must promise to listen carefully and follow instructions exactly. Working with tools requires respect and attention. The children nodded solemnly, clearly understanding that this was a privilege not to be taken lightly. Thomas selected a piece of scrap wood from his supplies, something smooth enough to be safe but substantial enough to provide a real learning experience. He demonstrated first, showing them how to hold the plane properly, how to apply even pressure, how to work with the grain of the wood rather than against it. Princess Charlotte proved to have particularly steady hands and a natural feel for the rhythm of the tool. Prince George approached the task with careful concentration, determined to master the technique through sheer focused effort. Prince Louis required more guidance, his small hands needing Thomas's larger ones to help control the plane, but he giggled with delight each time a perfect curl of wood shaving fell away from the surface. As they worked together, something unexpected happened. The formal distance that typically separated the royal children from the palace staff began to dissolve, replaced by the kind of natural camaraderie that develops when people share a common task. Thomas found himself falling into the teaching rhythm he remembered from working with Emma, patient and encouraging while maintaining the standards of craftsmanship that his father had instilled in him. The wood is telling us a story, he explained as Princess Charlotte worked carefully across the grain. See how it resists when we go against its nature? But, when we work with it, following the lines it wants to follow, it becomes smooth and beautiful. Is that why Papa says we should work with people's nature instead of fighting it? She asked, pausing in her careful work to look up at him. Thomas was struck by the sophistication of the question. I think your father is very wise, he replied. Whether we're working with wood or with people, the best results come from understanding and respecting the natural patterns, then helping them become their best version. By the end of their impromptu lesson, each child had created a small, smooth piece of wood that they could keep as a memento of their afternoon in the workshop. Thomas had enjoyed himself more than he had in months, rediscovering the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge and watching young minds grasp new concepts. As Mrs. Pemberton gently reminded the children that it was time to return for their evening activities, Princess Charlotte lingered for a moment. Mr. Thomas, she said, thank you for teaching us about the wood, and for telling us about Emma. I think she would be proud of how you take care of beautiful things. The comment was delivered with the same natural grace that Thomas had observed during their first encounter, but it carried a weight of understanding that seemed remarkable in someone so young. Princess Charlotte had somehow grasped not just what Thomas did, but why he did it, and she had offered him a perspective on his work and his loss that he had never considered. As the children walked away across the garden, their voices bright with excited chatter about their woodworking adventure, Thomas stood alone with his tools and his thoughts. The afternoon had unfolded in ways he could never have anticipated, revealing depths of connection and understanding that challenged his assumptions about the carefully maintained boundaries of palace life. He looked down at the bench, now fully repaired and ready to serve visitors for many more seasons. Like himself, it had been carefully restored, its damaged parts replaced with new wood while its essential character remained unchanged. Perhaps that was what Princess Charlotte had recognized in him, not someone broken beyond repair, but someone who had been damaged by life's storms and, then, carefully restored to function and purpose. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade as Thomas gathered his tools and prepared to finish his day's work. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new opportunities to tend and care and maintain the beauty that surrounded him. But, tonight, he would go home with the memory of children's laughter, the satisfaction of sharing knowledge, and the unexpected gift of being seen and understood by someone who would look past his uniform and his careful invisibility to recognize the person beneath. Emma would indeed have been proud, Thomas thought as he walked back toward the palace. Not just of his work, but of his willingness to open himself to new connections, new possibilities for meaning and joy. It was a lesson in blooming beyond season, in finding ways to thrive even when it seemed like the time for flourishing had passed. November arrived with an unexpected warmth that extended the growing season well beyond its typical boundaries. The roses that Princess Charlotte had admired were still blooming, their colors deeper and more intense than they had been in the gentler light of early autumn. Thomas took this as a positive omen, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly what he was hoping for. The woodworking lesson in the garden had opened something between Thomas and the royal children that continued to evolve in small, unexpected ways. Prince Louis had taken to waving enthusiastically whenever he spotted Thomas working around the grounds. Prince George occasionally stopped to ask questions about various maintenance projects, his curiosity extending beyond woodworking to encompass the full scope of palace upkeep. But it was Princess Charlotte whose continued interest in Thomas's work had begun to transform his daily routine in ways both subtle and profound. She had developed a habit of timing her outdoor breaks to coincide with his garden work, not in any intrusive way, but with the natural ease of someone who had come to view his presence as a welcome part of the landscape. Their conversations had grown more comfortable and wide-ranging, touching on everything from the science of plant growth to the history of the palace grounds to the philosophical implications of maintenance and care. What struck Thomas most about these interactions was Princess Charlotte's remarkable ability to ask questions that made him think about his work in entirely new ways. She seemed genuinely fascinated by the interconnections between different aspects of palace life, by the way that careful attention to small details created the foundation for larger beauty and functionality. On this particular Thursday morning, Thomas was working in the greenhouse, preparing seedlings for the winter planting that would ensure continuous color throughout the darker months. The work required patience and precision, qualities that he had developed over years of gardening, but that seemed especially important when nurturing plants that would need to survive harsh conditions. He was carefully transplanting delicate seedlings when he became aware of movement outside the greenhouse windows. Princess Charlotte was approaching with Mrs. Pemberton, but their pace was slower than usual, and there was something in the child's posture that suggested she was carrying a burden heavier than her usual schoolwork. When they entered the greenhouse, Thomas immediately noticed that Princess Charlotte's typically bright demeanor was subdued. She greeted him with her usual politeness, but the spark of curiosity that usually animated her questions was notably absent. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she said quietly. "Mrs. Pemberton thought I might like to see the winter preparations." Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Pemberton, whose slight nod suggested that the visit might be serving a purpose beyond simple botanical education. He had learned to read the subtle communications between palace staff members, and something in the older woman's expression indicated that Princess Charlotte might benefit from the kind of gentle, non-pressured conversation that seemed to develop naturally during garden work. "Of course, Your Highness," Thomas replied, setting down his transplanting tool. "I'd be happy to show you what we're preparing for the winter months." He guided Princess Charlotte through the rows of seedlings, explaining how different plants required different types of care, how some needed protection from cold while others actually required a period of winter dormancy to bloom properly in spring. As he talked, he found himself watching her face for signs of the engagement that usually characterized their conversations. But Princess Charlotte seemed distracted, responding to his explanations with automatic politeness rather than genuine interest. Her usual stream of insightful questions was replaced by brief nods and minimal responses. Thomas had seen this kind of withdrawal before, in Emma during the difficult periods of her illness when the weight of uncertainty and fear became too heavy for normal cheerfulness. After showing her several varieties of winter flowering plants, Thomas paused near a table where he had been working with a particularly delicate variety of primrose. The small flowers were remarkably resilient despite their fragile appearance, capable of blooming even in snow if they received proper care and protection. "These are perhaps my favorites for the winter garden," he said gently. "They look so delicate, but they're actually quite strong. Sometimes the most beautiful things are also the bravest." Princess Charlotte looked up at him then, and Thomas saw something in her eyes that reminded him powerfully of Emma during those final months. Not physical illness, but the kind of emotional burden that children sometimes carried when the adult world intruded on their carefully protected spheres. "Mr. Thomas," she said quietly, "how do you take care of something when you don't know if your care will be enough?" The question hung in the air between them, simple in its phrasing but profound in its implications. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied conversations that touched on loss and uncertainty. But he also recognized that Princess Charlotte was asking for more than gardening advice. She was seeking wisdom about something that was troubling her deeply. "That's perhaps the most important question anyone can ask about caring," Thomas replied carefully. "The truth is, we never know if our care will be enough. But we care anyway, because the caring itself matters, regardless of the outcome." Princess Charlotte was listening with the intense concentration he had come to associate with her most serious moments. Mrs. Pemberton had moved to the far end of the greenhouse, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to supervise. "When I was taking care of my daughter during her illness," Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject, "I often felt exactly as you describe. I wanted my love and care to be enough to make her better, to protect her from what was happening. But I learned that sometimes the most important care we can give is simply being present, being consistent, showing up every day regardless of what we can or cannot control." "But what if being present isn't enough?" Princess Charlotte asked, and Thomas could hear the weight of real worry in her voice. Thomas considered his response carefully. He had learned, through painful experience, that children dealing with difficult situations needed honest answers rather than false reassurances. But honesty needed to be tempered with hope, with recognition of what was possible even when outcomes were uncertain. "Then, we learn that love and care have value beyond their ability to change outcomes," he said finally. "Every act of caring, every moment of attention and tenderness, becomes part of who we are and who the people we care about become. Even when we can't control what happens, we can control how we respond, how present we are, how much love we bring to each moment." Princess Charlotte picked up one of the primrose seedlings, handling it with the careful attention she had learned during their woodworking lesson. "My grandmother has been unwell," she said quietly. "The doctors say she's going to be fine, but she looks so tired, and sometimes I see Mummy crying when she thinks no one is watching." Thomas felt a deep ache of recognition. Here was a child grappling with the universal experience of watching someone beloved face mortality, of feeling helpless in the face of circumstances beyond her control. It was the same struggle he had faced with Emma, the same desperate desire to fix what could not be fixed through sheer force of will or depth of love. "I'm sorry your grandmother is unwell," Thomas said gently. "It's very difficult to watch someone we love struggle, especially when we feel like there's nothing we can do to help. I've been trying to spend more time with her," Princess Charlotte continued, still carefully examining the small plant in her hands. "Reading to her, bringing her flowers from the garden, just sitting with her when she's too tired to talk. But I don't know if any of it makes a real difference." Thomas thought about the roses that Princess Charlotte had wanted to pick for her grandmother weeks earlier, about the child's instinctive understanding that beauty and presence could be offerings of love even when they couldn't cure illness or eliminate suffering. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that what you're doing makes more difference than you know. When my daughter was sick, some of my most precious memories are of the quiet moments we shared. The times when she was too tired for big activities, but we could still be together. Reading, talking about small things, just being in each other's presence." He paused, remembering afternoons when Emma had been too weak to leave her bed, but they had still managed to maintain their connection through gentle conversation and shared silence. Your grandmother knows you're there, Thomas continued. She feels your love in every visit, every flower, every moment you choose to spend with her instead of doing other things. That kind of faithful presence is one of the most powerful gifts anyone can offer. Princess Charlotte set the primrose seedling carefully back in its container, her movements thoughtful and precise. Emma was lucky to have you taking care of her, she said quietly. The simple statement, offered without drama or sentimentality, hit Thomas with unexpected force. No one had ever told him that Emma had been lucky to have him. He had spent years tormented by the sense that he had somehow failed her, that his love had not been enough to save her from suffering and death. But Princess Charlotte's perspective offered him a different way of understanding those final months. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "That means more to me than you know." They worked together for the next hour, transplanting seedlings and discussing the care requirements for different winter plants. The conversation gradually moved away from heavy topics, but the connection they had forged through honesty about difficult emotions continued to inform their interaction. Princess Charlotte seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing her worries about her grandmother had relieved some of the burden she had been carrying. Thomas found himself remembering aspects of caring for Emma that he had forgotten, not just the fear and helplessness, but also the profound intimacy of being trusted with someone's vulnerability, the privilege of being present during both difficult and peaceful moments. As their work session came to an end, Princess Charlotte helped Thomas clean and organize the tools they had used. Her movements had regained some of their usual confidence, and she asked several questions about the greenhouse heating system that demonstrated her characteristic curiosity about how things worked. "Mr. Thomas," she said as they finished putting away the last of the equipment, "would it be appropriate for me to bring some of these winter flowers to my grandmother when they're ready to bloom?" "I think that would be very appropriate," Thomas replied. "In fact, I'll make sure to prepare a special arrangement when the primroses reach their peak. They should be perfect in about 2 weeks." Princess Charlotte smiled, the first genuinely bright expression he had seen from her that morning. "She'll love them. And I'll tell her about how brave they are, blooming even when it's cold and dark." As she walked away with Mrs. Pemberton, Princess Charlotte turned back for a moment. "Thank you for helping me understand about caring," she called out. "I'll remember what you said about showing up every day." Thomas stood alone in the greenhouse among the seedlings that would soon brave the winter weather, feeling a familiar mixture of sadness and hope. His conversation with Princess Charlotte had awakened memories of Emma that were both painful and precious. But it had also reminded him that the lessons he had learned through loss could be shared, that his experience of loving someone through difficult circumstances could offer comfort and guidance to others facing similar challenges. The princess was learning, perhaps earlier than anyone would wish, that love sometimes meant bearing witness to suffering without being able to eliminate it. But she was also learning that faithful presence, consistent caring, and small acts of beauty and attention could transform even the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for profound connection. As Thomas began preparing for his afternoon duties, he found himself thinking about the flowers he would arrange for Princess Charlotte's grandmother. He would choose the bravest bloomers, the ones most willing to offer beauty despite harsh conditions. They would serve as messengers, carrying not just visual beauty but also the deeper message that care and attention could flourish even in the midst of uncertainty. The cycle of seasons would continue, bringing both loss and renewal, difficulty and growth. But Thomas was beginning to understand that his role in that cycle was not simply to maintain the external appearance of beauty. He was also helping to cultivate the kind of resilience and hope that allowed people to continue blooming even when circumstances suggested that their season for flourishing had ended. Princess Charlotte had taught him that caring was not measured by its ability to control outcomes, but by the consistency of attention and love it brought to each moment. It was a lesson that reframed not just his understanding of gardening, but his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life in a world where loss and uncertainty were inevitable companions to love and growth. December arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made every detail of the palace grounds stand out in sharp relief. The formal gardens had transitioned into their winter configuration, with the hardiest plants providing structure and color against the increasingly bare landscape. Thomas had spent weeks preparing for this transformation, ensuring that the garden would maintain its beauty even during the darkest months of the year. 2 weeks had passed since his conversation with Princess Charlotte about caring for her grandmother, and Thomas had been carefully tending the primroses that would soon be ready for arrangement. The small flowers had responded well to his attention, producing blooms of unusual intensity and resilience. He planned to create the promised bouquet that weekend, when the flowers would be at their absolute peak. On this Friday afternoon, Thomas was working in the area near the palace's main entrance, replacing sections of pathway stones that had been damaged by the early winter weather. It was detail work that required precision but left his mind free to wander, and he found himself thinking about the changes that the past few months had brought to his daily experience. His interactions with Princess Charlotte and her brothers had awakened something in Thomas that he had thought was permanently dormant. The simple pleasure of teaching, of sharing knowledge and watching young minds grasp new concepts, had reminded him of aspects of himself that predated his years of careful emotional isolation. He was still the same quiet, reliable member of the palace staff, but he no longer felt quite so invisible, either to himself or to others. The work was absorbing enough that Thomas didn't immediately notice the approach of footsteps on the gravel path. When he looked up, he saw Princess Charlotte walking toward him with a purposefulness that suggested she was seeking him out specifically rather than simply happening to pass by. But there was something different about her appearance that caught Thomas's attention immediately. Princess Charlotte was carrying a small, wrapped package, and her expression carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness that suggested the item was significant in some way. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," she said as she approached, her greeting carrying the formal politeness that always marked their initial interactions before they settled into more comfortable conversation. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," Thomas replied, setting down his tools and giving her his full attention. "How are the preparations for the weekend celebration coming along?" Thomas knew that the royal family was planning a small gathering to celebrate the Queen's improving health, a private event that had been organized after doctors had declared her recovery from the recent illness was progressing better than expected. The palace staff had been working for days to ensure that every detail would be perfect for the occasion. "Very well, thank you," Princess Charlotte replied. "Grandmother is feeling much stronger, and she's excited about having the whole family together. The flowers you've been preparing are absolutely beautiful, by the way. I saw them in the greenhouse yesterday." "I'm glad they meet with approval," Thomas said. "They should be ready for cutting tomorrow morning, just as we planned." Princess Charlotte nodded, then seemed to gather herself for something more significant. "Mr. Thomas, I wanted to speak with you about something important. The flowers you're preparing for grandmother have given me an idea, and I've spoken with my parents about it." Thomas felt a flutter of uncertainty. In his experience, conversations that began with references to speaking with parents often led to changes in established routines or relationships. He hoped that his interactions with the children hadn't somehow crossed invisible lines of palace protocol. "I've been thinking a great deal about our conversations," Princess Charlotte continued, "particularly about what you said regarding care and presence and showing up consistently for people we love. It's helped me understand my own feelings about grandmother's illness, but it's also made me think about other things." She paused, seeming to organize her thoughts before continuing. "I've realized that you take care of so many beautiful things here at the palace, and that your work makes it possible for our family and our visitors to enjoy all of this beauty. But I don't think anyone has ever properly thanked you for that, or acknowledged how important your contributions are." Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with touched surprise. "Your Highness, that's very kind, but it's not necessary. I'm simply doing the work I'm paid to do." "But that's exactly what I mean," Princess Charlotte said with the earnest intensity he had come to recognize as characteristic of her most serious moments. "You don't do just what you're paid to do. You do your work with love and attention and pride. You see the individual needs of every plant, every tool, every part of the garden. You teach children about woodworking and caring for growing things. You understand that beauty requires constant, patient attention." She held up the wrapped package she had been carrying. "So I've made something for you, with help from my art instructor and my mother. It's a small gift, but I hope it conveys how much your presence here means, not just to the gardens but to the people who have been lucky enough to learn from you." Thomas stared at the package, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. In 12 years of palace service, no member of the royal family had ever given him a personal gift. The protocol for such situations was unclear to him, and he found himself uncertain about how to respond appropriately. "Your Highness," he began, "I'm deeply honored, but I'm not sure it's proper for me to accept." "My parents have approved," Princess Charlotte said gently, understanding his hesitation. "They agree that exceptional service and kindness deserve recognition, regardless of traditional protocol." With careful hands, Thomas unwrapped the package. Inside was a small watercolor painting, executed with the skill that suggested considerable time and attention had been devoted to its creation. The subject was immediately recognizable. It was the rose garden where he and Princess Charlotte had first spoken, but painted from memory with the kind of emotional detail that captured not just the visual reality but the feeling of the space. The roses were rendered in soft, glowing colors that seemed to emanate their own light. The pathways curved gracefully through the composition, leading the eye toward a small figure in the background who was clearly meant to represent Thomas himself, working among the flowers with obvious care and attention. But what struck Thomas most powerfully was the way Princess Charlotte had painted the light in the garden, warm and golden and somehow hopeful, as if the space itself was infused with the care that had been devoted to its maintenance. "It's beautiful," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control. "I don't have words for how much this means to me." "There's an inscription on the back," Princess Charlotte said softly. Thomas turned the small canvas over and found, in Princess Charlotte's careful handwriting, the words, "To Mr. Thomas, who helps beautiful things bloom even in the darkest seasons. With gratitude and admiration, Charlotte." For a moment, Thomas couldn't speak. The painting, the inscription, the thoughtfulness behind the entire gesture, it was more recognition and appreciation than he had received in years, and it came from someone whose opinion had somehow become incredibly important to him. "Your Highness," he finally managed, "this is one of the most precious gifts I've ever received. I'll treasure it always." Princess Charlotte smiled with obvious pleasure at his reaction. "I'm so glad you like it. I wanted to capture not just how the garden looks, but how it feels when you're working in it. There's something special about the way you attend to things, something that makes the whole space feel more alive." Thomas looked again at the painting, seeing in Princess Charlotte's interpretation of his work a reflection he had never been able to achieve on his own. Through her eyes, his daily labor became something beautiful and meaningful, an act of artistic creation that transformed both the physical environment and the people who encountered it. "I have something else to tell you," Princess Charlotte continued. "My parents have been observing the way you interact with us children, and they've been impressed by your teaching ability and your natural understanding of how to help young people learn practical skills." Thomas felt another flutter of uncertainty. He hoped he hadn't overstepped boundaries by allowing the children to participate in his work. "They would like to formalize your role somewhat," Princess Charlotte explained. "Not changing your primary responsibilities, but adding an official component that would involve teaching us and other young visitors about gardening, maintenance, and traditional crafts. They believe that understanding how things work and how to care for them is an important part of our education." The proposal was so unexpected that Thomas needed a moment to process its implications. Not only was he not in trouble for his interactions with the children, but the royal family wanted to expand his teaching role, to make it an official part of his position at the palace. "They've also suggested," Princess Charlotte added, "that you might be interested in developing a small workshop space where these activities could take place more regularly. Nothing elaborate, just a place where hands-on learning could happen safely and systematically." Thomas thought about the joy he had experienced while teaching the children to use woodworking tools, about Princess Charlotte's thoughtful questions and Prince Louis's infectious enthusiasm for learning new skills. The prospect of making such interactions a regular part of his work was more appealing than he could have imagined. "I would be honored to take on such responsibilities," Thomas said carefully. "Teaching young people about traditional skills and the care of growing things would be a privilege." Princess Charlotte's smile broadened into genuine delight. "Wonderful. Mother thought you would be interested. She said that anyone who could help children understand the connection between patience and beauty would be an excellent teacher." As they talked about the practical details of the proposed role expansion, Thomas found himself marveling at the unexpected direction his life was taking. 3 months earlier, he had been convinced that his capacity for meaningful connection with others had died with Emma. But Princess Charlotte's gentle recognition of his work and character had opened possibilities he hadn't even known he was hoping for. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Pemberton, who was clearly seeking Princess Charlotte for some scheduled activity. But, before leaving, the princess had one final thing to share. "Mr. Thomas," she said, "I wanted you to know that grandmother has been asking about the person who grows the beautiful flowers that I've been bringing to her. When I told her about our conversations, about what you taught me regarding care and presence, she said she would like to meet you sometime, if that would be appropriate." Thomas felt a surge of nervous excitement. The prospect of meeting the Queen personally was both intimidating and deeply moving. It represented a level of recognition that extended far beyond his role as a maintenance worker. "I would be deeply honored by such an introduction," Thomas replied. "I'll speak with Mother about arranging it," Princess Charlotte said. "Perhaps during the celebration this weekend, when Grandmother is feeling strong and everyone is gathered together." As Princess Charlotte walked away with Mrs. Pemberton, Thomas stood alone on the pathway, holding the painting and trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just occurred. The small watercolors seemed to glow in the afternoon light, capturing not just the visual beauty of the garden but something more elusive and precious, the recognition that care and attention could transform ordinary work into something approaching art. That evening, as Thomas rode the bus home to his small flat, he found himself seeing the familiar route with new eyes. The painting rested carefully on his lap, wrapped in protective paper, but he could visualize every detail of Princess Charlotte's rendering of the garden. More than that, he could see himself through her eyes, not as an invisible servant, but as someone whose work contributed meaningfully to the beauty and functionality of an important place. For the first time since Emma's death, Thomas allowed himself to imagine a future that included not just survival and routine, but growth and connection and the kind of purposeful work that could honor both his daughter's memory and his own capacity for creating beauty in the world. The roses would continue to bloom out of season, the children would continue to learn about the connection between patience and growth, and Thomas would continue to show up each day with the kind of consistent care that transformed ordinary maintenance into something approaching love. Princess Charlotte had seen this truth clearly, and, in seeing it, had helped Thomas begin to see it too. The gentle touch of recognition, offered by a 7-year-old princess who understood instinctively that care and attention were forms of artistry, had awakened possibilities that Thomas was only beginning to explore. But, for the first time in 12 years, he was genuinely excited to discover what might bloom from such unexpected and precious encouragement.